Inside America's deadliest prison, ADX Florence. The prison designed to end violence forever, ADX Florence does not sit near a city. It does not loom over highways. It does not cast a shadow over neighborhoods. It sits in near isolation in Fremont County, Colorado, surrounded by open land, distant mountains, and silence. That isolation is not accidental. It is the first layer of security. Officially, it is called the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. Most people know it by another name. ADX Florence. It is often described as the most secure prison in the United States. Others call it the end of the line. Some former officials have described it as a place designed to hold people who cannot be managed anywhere else. But what makes ADX Florence truly different is not its security systems. It is the philosophy behind it. Why ADX Florence exists. To understand ADX Florence, you have to understand the fear that created it. By the late 1980s, the Federal Bureau of Prisons faced a problem it could no longer control using traditional methods. A small number of inmates, extremely violent, highly influential, or ideologically driven, continued to attack staff, organize violence, or destabilize even the highest security federal prisons. Transfers did not work. Lockdowns did not work. Segregation units did not work. Some inmates assaulted correctional officers repeatedly. Others orchestrated violence without ever touching anyone. A few inspired chaos simply by existing near other inmates. The system reached a conclusion it rarely says out loud: as long as people could interact, violence could reorganize itself. So the Bureau of Prisons made a radical decision. They would build a prison where interaction itself was eliminated. A prison designed around isolation. ADX Florence opened in 1994. From the beginning, it was not designed like any other prison in America. This was not a place for rehabilitation programs, group therapy, or shared recreation yards. It was a facility built almost entirely around long-term solitary confinement. Each inmate would live alone, eat alone, recreate alone, move alone. Cells were constructed of poured concrete. Furniture was fixed to the floor. Windows were narrow and positioned to show sky, but no horizon. This detail was intentional. Seeing the horizon allows the brain to orient itself in space. Removing it subtly disrupts perception over time. ADX Florence was not built to punish loudly. It was built to punish continuously. Life inside a Supermax cell. An ADX Florence cell measures roughly 7 by 12 feet. Inside is a concrete bed, a concrete desk, a combined sink-toilet unit, and a narrow window. The door is solid steel, controlled electronically. In most cases, inmates spend 23 hours a day inside this cell. Meals are delivered through a slot. Communication is minimal and procedural. Human contact is rare. The remaining hour is typically spent alone in a small concrete recreation enclosure, sometimes described as a dog run, open to the sky but surrounded by walls. There are no group activities. No communal dining. No shared exercise. This is not segregation as a temporary measure. This is the default condition. Silence as a security tool. ADX Florence is often described as quiet. Not calm, quiet. There are no shouting tears. No clanging doors. No crowds moving through corridors. Movement is tightly scheduled and controlled. When inmates leave their cells, it is usually alone and under escort. Interaction between inmates is deliberately minimized. This silence is not a side effect. It is a feature. Noise is unpredictable. Silence is controllable. And control is the core objective of ADX Florence. Who gets sent to ADX Florence? ADX Florence does not house large numbers of inmates. It was never meant to. Instead, it holds a very specific population, individuals deemed too dangerous, too disruptive, or too influential to be housed anywhere else in the federal system. This includes inmates who repeatedly assaulted staff, individuals linked to large-scale organized crime, terrorism-related offenders, prisoners who continued violent behavior even in high-security prisons. Placement at ADX Florence is not part of a sentence handed down by a judge. It is an administrative decision made by the Bureau of Prisons. That distinction matters, because it means inmates can be sent there, and kept there, without a fixed timeline for release back to lower security. Violence without riots. One of the most striking facts about ADX Florence is what does not happen there. There are no riots. No mass fights. No organized uprisings. From a traditional security standpoint, the prison works. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If visible violence disappears, what replaces it? The psychological cost of total isolation. Medical and psychological research has long shown that extended solitary confinement causes predictable harm. This is not debated science. Effects commonly include chronic anxiety, severe depression, sleep disorders, difficulty concentrating, emotional numbness, paranoia. In extreme cases, individuals experience hallucinations or lose the ability to regulate emotions. In ADX Florence, these conditions are not short-term. Some inmates have spent years or decades under these restrictions. The environment does not adapt to the person. The person is expected to adapt to the environment. When symptoms become infractions, one of the most controversial aspects of ADX Florence is how psychological deterioration is handled. Behavioral symptoms caused by isolation, such as withdrawal, agitation, or confusion, are often treated as disciplinary issues. This creates a self-reinforcing loop. Isolation causes distress. Distress produces behavior. Behavior justifies continued isolation. The system sustains itself quietly. There is no dramatic moment where harm begins. It is constant. The step-down promise. In theory, ADX Florence is not meant to be permanent. The Bureau of Prisons maintains a step-down program, designed to gradually transition inmates to less restrictive environments through compliance and behavioral benchmarks. On paper, this appears humane. In practice, progress is slow, opaque, and fragile. Criteria are strict. Evaluations are subjective. Setbacks can erase years of compliance. For some inmates, the path out exists. For others, ADX becomes effectively indefinite. Lawsuits and public scrutiny. For years, ADX Florence operated largely outside public attention. That changed when lawsuits began to expose internal conditions, particularly regarding inmates with severe mental illness. Court filings revealed patterns: individuals with diagnosed mental illness held in extreme isolation, medical professionals warning of psychological harm, internal acknowledgement of deteriorating mental health. These cases forced limited reforms. But they did not dismantle the core structure of ADX Florence. Isolation remained the foundation. Why ADX Florence still exists despite criticism. ADX Florence continues to operate for one central reason. From a security standpoint, it works. It prevents riots. It limits assaults. It neutralizes influence. The question is not whether ADX Florence reduces violence. The question is where that violence goes. Because harm does not disappear. It changes form. ADX Florence was built to end chaos in America's federal prisons. And in many ways, it succeeded. But it did so by redefining punishment itself, shifting it from physical confrontation to psychological endurance, from visible disorder to invisible erosion. By design, ADX Florence eliminates the conditions that allow violence to spread. There are no crowds to influence. No gatherings to organize. No proximity to exploit. What remains is control, precise, continuous, and nearly absolute. But when control becomes the environment itself, a different question emerges: what happens to a person when the world is reduced to one room, one routine, and one set of rules, year after year? This is where ADX Florence becomes something more than a prison. It becomes a long-term psychological experiment with no clear endpoint. Years without change for some individuals, ADX Florence is a brief stop, months or a few years before transfer to a less restrictive facility. For others, it becomes a decade. Sometimes longer. In these cases, daily life does not evolve. There are no seasons inside the cell. No meaningful markers of progress. The environment remains constant. This constancy is not neutral. Human beings rely on change to regulate time and emotion. Remove change, and the mind begins to compress days into something indistinguishable. Memory blurs. Motivation fades. The calendar still moves. But internally, time stalls. The step-down system, promise and reality. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX Florence is not meant to be permanent. The step-down program is designed to provide a pathway out, an incremental reduction in restrictions earned through sustained compliance. On paper, the system looks orderly: gradual increases in out-of-cell time, limited, supervised interaction, progressive movement toward lower security units. In practice, the process is slow and uncertain. Benchmarks are strict. Evaluations are subjective. One incident, sometimes minor, can erase years of progress. For individuals already affected by isolation, navigating these expectations can be difficult. Symptoms caused by long-term confinement can be interpreted as failure to comply. The result is a paradox: the conditions that require improvement are the same conditions that prevent it. Mental health in a place built for control. ADX Florence was not designed as a mental health facility. It was designed as a security solution. Over time, however, mental health became unavoidable. Court records and independent investigations revealed that individuals with serious mental illness were housed under extreme isolation, often for extended periods. Psychologists and medical staff raised concerns about deterioration. The core issue was not whether mental health care existed; it did. The issue was whether care could meaningfully counteract the environment. Medication can stabilize symptoms. Monitoring can document decline. But neither can replace human contact. When the court stepped in, public awareness of ADX Florence increased after lawsuits challenged the use of prolonged solitary confinement, particularly for individuals with severe mental illness. Legal filings brought internal documents into the open, warnings from clinicians, records of self-harm and psychological decline, acknowledgement that isolation worsened existing conditions, settlements forced changes. Some individuals were removed from extreme isolation. Specialized mental health units were expanded. Review processes were adjusted. But the prison's core structure remained intact. Isolation continued to be the foundation. Why ADX Florence is still defended. Supporters of ADX Florence point to measurable outcomes. There are no riots. Assaults are rare. Escapes are virtually non-existent. From a security perspective, the prison succeeds. Correctional officers work in an environment with reduced physical confrontation. Other facilities are protected from the influence of inmates deemed unmanageable elsewhere. The argument is simple: without ADX Florence, violence would return to the broader system. This belief sustains the prison's existence. But it does not answer a deeper question. Violence reconsidered. Violence is often defined narrowly, as physical harm inflicted by one person on another. ADX Florence challenges that definition. Here, violence is not explosive. It is cumulative. It unfolds through long-term deprivation, sensory restriction, uncertainty, loss of identity. The damage is slower. The evidence is quieter. And because it lacks spectacle, it is easier to justify. The human mind under total control. Extended isolation changes how the brain processes the world. Sound becomes intrusive. Silence becomes heavy. Routine becomes survival. Some individuals adapt by withdrawing emotionally. Others become hypervigilant. Some lose the ability to engage with complexity. These adaptations help people endure confinement. They do not prepare them for life beyond it. Leaving ADX Florence, not everyone at ADX Florence remains there forever. Some complete the step-down process and transfer to other high-security prisons. A smaller number are released directly into society. For those individuals, the transition can be overwhelming. Crowds feel threatening. Noise feels chaotic. Decision-making feels exhausting. Skills developed to survive isolation, emotional suppression, constant alertness, do not disappear when the doors open. The prison ends. The conditioning does not. The impact on staff, the environment at ADX Florence shapes more than the incarcerated population. Correctional officers operate within a system that minimizes interaction and prioritizes consistency. Emotional distance is not indifference, it is a survival mechanism. But over time, distance becomes habit. Working in near silence, enforcing strict routines, and limiting contact affects how people communicate and perceive risk. The system protects staff physically. It changes them psychologically. A prison that reflects a choice. ADX Florence exists because a decision was made. Faced with unmanageable violence, the federal system chose isolation over interaction, certainty over risk, and silence over chaos. That decision solved one problem. It created another. Is there an alternative? Critics argue that no prison should rely on decades-long isolation. Supporters argue that no alternative has proven capable of managing certain individuals safely. Between these positions lies an unresolved tension. How much control is too much? At what point does preventing harm become harm itself? There is no consensus. There is only evidence and experience. What ADX Florence represents. ADX Florence is not an anomaly. It is the logical endpoint of a philosophy that prioritizes security above all else. Remove interaction. Eliminate unpredictability. Reduce people to manageable units. It is efficient. It is quiet. It is effective. It is also deeply controversial. The final measure, if a prison's success is measured solely by the absence of riots, ADX Florence is a success. If it is measured by the long-term well-being of the people inside it, the answer is far less clear. What ADX Florence ultimately reveals is not a failure of policy, but the cost of a particular kind of success. Order achieved through isolation does not come free. Someone pays for it. Closing reflection. ADX Florence was built to end violence in America's federal prisons. And in doing so, it redefined what punishment could look like. Not loud. Not chaotic. Not visible. But constant. Silent. And enduring. This is why ADX Florence remains one of the most controversial prisons in the world. Not because of what happens there in a single moment, but because of what happens there over time.